Good morning, ladies and gentlemen, and thank you, David, for your inspiring opening presentation of the day. It's great to be here, ladies and gentlemen, to see so many of you and to hear all of the good things that the association, that IWEA are doing, that you are achieving, and to hear the very positive outlook, David, that you have just given us for the further development of wind energy in Ireland. And congratulations to you, David, for the leadership that you are bringing to the association, to the industry in Ireland now, and to all of your staff for the great things that you are achieving. All of the national wind energy associations of Europe are members of Wind Europe, along with all of our corporate members, of course. And I'm very pleased to say that when we sit in Brussels and look out at all of the national associations, you are up there as one of the most effective. So congratulations for that. These are the members of Wind Europe. It's the whole value chain of wind energy, the turbine manufacturers, supply chain, developers, utilities, banks, law firms, consultancies, and so on. And this is wind in Europe today. So we're 12% of Europe's electricity. We're 173 gigawatts installed. The blue bars you see are every country's installed capacity in gigawatts. The red bars are the share of wind in every country's electricity mix. Look at the blue line here. This is wind energy capacity across Europe compared to power generation capacity for all the other fuels and technologies. As you can see, we are now number 2. Only gas has more capacity than wind. As you can see, we'll be overtaking them quite soon, because here are what we expect on the right-hand side to be our new installations over the next 5 years. Pretty healthy numbers. You can see around 15, 16 gigawatts a year. The light blue is offshore, but the dark blue is onshore. And this is interesting, because people often think wind energy in Europe increasingly is going to be an offshore play. Well, no. 81% of everything we build over the next 5 years will still be onshore. Now, who are the leaders here? Germany on the left-hand side, France, Spain, and Sweden. But you can see we've highlighted Ireland here. We expect you to be installing another 1,400 megawatts over the next 5 years. So how does it look going up to 2030? Well, we expect further significant growth across Europe. We've got 3 scenarios here. In our central scenario, we think there'll be 323 gigawatts of wind installed by 2030. As you can see, the vast majority of it still onshore. Now, some of you might be listening to me thinking, okay, for 2020, it worked okay with Brussels because every country had a binding national renewables target. But that is not going to be the case for 2030. We've just got a binding EU-wide target now, and countries can do what they want. Well, it's not quite like that, ladies and gentlemen. Things are much better than that. First of all, the EU target, as you all know, we managed to get it up from the 27% that the Commission originally proposed to 32% of all energy consumed in the EU by 2030. That was a significant achievement. Now, within that, every national government in Europe has, over the next 15 months, got to agree with Brussels a National Energy and Climate Plan, NECP or NECAP. And that national plan has to define exactly what new renewables each country is going to be deploying between now and 2030. The first draft of these national plans, each government has to submit to Brussels by the end of this year, which of course ties in directly to the consultation that David has just mentioned on the new national energy strategy here. And then the final version of this plan will be agreed in a negotiation between each national government and the European Commission by the end of next year. These national plans will define the size and shape of every national market for the next 10 years. So they are hugely important documents. And if the level of ambition across all of these national plans is not adding up to 32%, then the Commission will put pressure on the national governments to ensure that they do over the next 12 months. That is what is going to happen. Can I just say one small observation on the 32% EU target? It was a great achievement getting that, rather than 27%. And later this afternoon, you're going to be seeing the man who we in Wind Europe judge is more responsible than anybody else, certainly in the European Parliament, for having delivered that, and that is Sean Kelly. Sean, as you know, is from the EPP, the centre-right grouping in the European Parliament. They were sceptical about having a higher renewables target. He was the one man in that group who persuaded sufficient number of his fellow MEPs in the centre-right group to vote for more ambition. He did a great job. He was often very lonely and very exposed within his group in the Parliament, but he stuck his neck out. Of course, the Greens and the Socialists, they were supporting more ambition, but Sean's own group were not. Because he was so brave and so painstaking in what he did, we, Wind Europe, are pushing him now for the award of MEP of the Year. And I would strongly urge all of you to support that nomination as well. And David, Peter, I will share with you the link by which you can vote for Sean as MEP of the Year. In our view, it's an accolade that he deserves. Now, back to those national plans. They will detail the new renewables that are going to be deployed, but they will also detail something else. Look at this. This is today's installed wind energy capacity in Europe, the 170 gigawatts. And this is what happens to it by the 2040s if we do nothing. We have zilch. Now, those national plans not only have to detail the new renewables that are going to be built, they have to detail what every country's plan is for the existing assets that are going to come to the end of their normal operational life between now and 2030. So there's got to be a plan for repowering. There's got to be a plan for lifetime extension. This is absolutely crucial if we're going to meet our 2030 target. It's amazing. Until quite recently, you would talk to governments across Europe and they would assume that renewables were on an inexorable upward path. We're just adding new wind farms and new solar parks, and that's that. We don't have to worry about the existing stuff. And slowly we've managed to persuade people that actually the existing stuff comes offline eventually. And you've got to have a plan in place with incentives in place for lifetime extension and repowering. And that means nice, flexible permitting planning regimes for that as well. Here are the actual numbers of what we're going to be losing because of the end-of-life conundrum over the next 5 years. Europe will lose between 4.3, 6.4 gigawatts in total, will be fully decommissioned, will disappear. These are wind farms on sites where we can't do a lifetime extension, we can't do a repowering because the environmental legislation has changed, the permitting regime has changed, somebody's built a house next to the wind farm, it falls foul of a distance law. Okay? Over half of this is in Germany. And this is something we're going to have to keep a very close eye on now going forward. Repowering, this is the potential volumes, could become the mainstay in many countries of Europe of the onshore market. Probably not here in Ireland where you have so much significant scope still for further greenfield developments, but elsewhere this will be a key issue. Now, this is the most important slide I am going to show you. This is what the International Energy Agency thinks will be the share of wind in Europe's electricity mix between now and 2040. We are red, ladies and gentlemen. So, soon after 2025, wind is going to be the #1 source of electricity in Europe. The executive director of the International Energy Agency, Fatih Birol, presented this slide at the Global Wind Summit at our annual event in Hamburg 3 weeks ago. And just like many of you have, a lot of people got their phones out and took a picture. He was actually giving us a bit of an advance here. This is going to be in the World Energy Outlook, which is not due out until the 13th of November. But he wanted to share with us this good news that soon after 2025, we are #1. What does that mean in actual numbers? Well, in Wind Europe, we think by 2030, wind will be nearly 30% of the electricity mix in Europe. And we think, and this is consistent with what you have just said, David, that wind will be 67% of your electricity mix in 2030, that you'll be #2 in Europe in terms of the share of wind in your power mix. Fantastic, great, but, and it's a very big but, ladies and gentlemen. Electricity is only the yellow. It's only 24% of total energy consumption in Europe. Transport is 31%, heating is 45%. And let's see how much renewables we're getting into each of these segments. We're doing well in electricity. Yes, renewables is now 30% of Europe's total power mix. Great! But it's only 18% of heating, and it's only 8% of transport. Now, the policy goal for the European Union is pretty clear. We want to decarbonize energy by 2050. Clearly, if we are going to achieve that, we've got to get much, much more renewables into heating and transport. And of course, we've got to keep increasing the share of renewables in electricity. And the only way we can get more renewables into heating and transport is through electrification. We've just published a report. Here it is, Breaking New Ground. This is all about how wind energy can help electrify heating and transport and thereby help decarbonize energy in Europe. I've got a few copies on the desk. Please help yourself. Now, what this report says is that it is possible, technically, and it's affordable, to increase the share of electricity in energy from today's 24% in Europe to 62% by 2050. That would mean increasing the share of electricity in transport from 1% to over 50%, increasing the share of electricity in buildings and in industrial processes as well. And look at the bottom right-hand corner. With more electricity in our energy supply, we become more energy efficient because the total unit of energy consumption through electricity is much lower than it is if you're powering heating and transport from fossil fuels. So we reduce energy demand by 33% by 2050, which is good. We increase electricity demand, but we reduce energy demand. That's good for the economy as a whole. But this is a big challenge. We're going to need more ambitious policies than we currently have in place. And if we look at Ireland, for example, how are you going to electrify heating? Electrifying heating is much easier in those countries with big centralized heat networks or district heating. Here in Ireland, district heating is only 1% of your total heating, so it's a much bigger challenge for you. But we believe that with the mass deployment of electric heat pumps and some retrofitting of the building stock with electric heat pumps, this is achievable everywhere in Europe. Of course, there is a cost. Total cost is 2.7% of GDP in Europe by 2050. That would be the cost of paying for energy supplies in Europe as a percentage of GDP. Today, that number is around 2.0%. So there's an increased cost there. But that is offset by the reduced cost of climate mitigation. Because our energy consumption would go down, we'd be more energy efficient, the cost of reducing our CO2 emissions would go down from 1.2% of GDP to 0.86%. But still, there is a small net cost to society as a whole. But if we look at the other benefits, we're probably in the money, because the other benefits that come from electrification are this: more energy efficiency, as I've said. We reduce pollution. We improve air quality hugely by shifting out of fossil fuels powering heating and transport to electricity powering them. There are various estimates for the costs to Europe today of treating people in our health systems for respiratory diseases and other ailments that they have as a result of air quality. And the lowest estimate is at least 3% of GDP. Okay? Big savings to be had there. We strengthen our energy security. Europe is importing 54% of all of our energy today. 1 billion euros every day is what the EU spends on energy imports, on fossil fuel imports. The more electric we are, the less gas and oil we have to import from Russia and elsewhere. And of course, with more electrification, we give consumers more control over their electricity bills. If you're powering your motor car purely from petrol, you pay the standard price at the petrol pump, which never changes. But if you've got an electric vehicle, you can choose to charge it when the electricity bills are lower at night, when the tariffs are lower. so it's cheaper for our citizens to have more electricity in our economy. And of course, most important benefit of all jobs is what will come from the electrification of heating and transport. Now, I said we need some more ambitious policies than those we currently have to drive this electrification. We need to get rid of the disincentives in the tax systems. Today, taxes on gas are generally lower than taxes on electricity. So what's the incentive for a consumer to shift from gas heating in their home to electric heating? Those disincentives have got to go. We need to spend more money on grids. Sure, if there's more electricity in the system, we're going to need bigger, stronger grids. We will need more ambitious targets for electric vehicles. Some of you will have seen that the EU, the member states in the Council in Brussels this week, agreed that there should be a 35% target at least for the reduction of CO2 emissions from motor cars over the next 10 years. And we're going to need more hydrogen in our energy system as well. That is taking renewable electricity, electrolyzing it into clean hydrogen, and using that clean hydrogen to power industrial processes, refineries, and so on. But we need a big increase in grid investments. Let's not hide from that. Where you see the trough, those have been the level of grid investments in Europe over the last 5 years. We've not been investing enough. And you can see the big peak on the right-hand side. That's what we need to be investing in terms of the gigawatt kilometers per annum. It's a big increase. Now, the money is available. And the TSOs all have AAA credit ratings. They can raise the capital. The big challenge here is going to be public acceptance. There are already issues in many parts of Europe about the acceptability of new power lines being built. And of course, we're going to need a more flexible electricity market, more flexibility in our system overall, more interconnectors between countries in Europe, more flexible power plants, backup plants. We're going to need some hydrogen and power to gas, more flexible renewables, more demand response. That's going to be key. More variable demand matching the variable supply that's coming from having more variable renewables on the system. We're going to need more energy storage. That means new technologies, and of course electric vehicles are going to have a key role to play. Now, when we're talking about flexible energy systems, flexible electricity markets, of course, I have to say this, that you are a model for the system integration of variable renewables. ICEM model, of course, is now in force. You are already equal second in terms of the share of wind in your electricity mix. So you have had to be more advanced than other countries in Europe in terms of how you integrate variable renewables in your system. And ICEM now, with the greater emphasis on intraday trading, with wind having full access to the balancing and other ancillary service markets, with the greater role of those ancillary service markets, fast frequency response and so on, in your energy system, you're giving a very good example. I'll be coming back to Ireland next week to Cork, to the Air Grid annual conference, and look forward to discussing those issues there with your colleagues in Air Grid. That's great. That's fine. Let's talk about the money and the business case for the further expansion of wind. This is the story on cost reduction in onshore wind over the last 5 years. In Europe, you're familiar with this, declining costs as a result of larger turbines, more efficient manufacturing, and so on. This is the story on offshore wind. It's very similar. But there is still a gap. Let me talk you through this slide. The yellow that you see on the top is the range of the costs of offshore wind in Europe today. The blue is the range of the costs for onshore wind, and you can see they overlap. That's where you've got the dirty color in the middle. Now, the red is a reasonable estimate of what wholesale electricity prices could be doing on average in Europe over the next 12 months. We've built in a peak there, but this is roughly the sort of level we expect, perhaps averaging something around 30 to 40 euros. What you see here is that although our costs have come down, there is still a gap. There is still a delta between the costs and the revenue that we're going to be getting from the wholesale electricity price. So what is the answer? We need auctions. It's as simple as that. And now you have it here in Ireland with the RES. Ideally, auctions should be technology specific. We know the RES is not, but so be it. We know that you're pretty confident you can make the RES work for you. Crucially, avoid auctions that allow people to bid in at zero. Because if you bid in at zero, the only revenue you're going to get is the red here. And you're going to have a gap between your revenue and your costs. And this is a message we're consistently giving to governments. Governments say to us, so we have to keep subsidizing wind then, do we? We thought subsidies were the past. And we say, well, no, actually, it's not about subsidy. It's more about revenue stabilization. Because if you look at this, there are two problems. First, the gap, and second, the variability of the wholesale price. And of course, with more renewables on the system, wholesale prices are more variable than they used to be. But if you can offer stable revenues, and your RES is going to be giving you stable revenues, then you mitigate that issue. Okay, now, there's one thing that is happening out there in the market which is helping us to plug this gap between our costs and our revenues, and this is corporate renewable PPAs. They are expanding rapidly, as you know, and you here in Ireland are making a significant contribution to this. You are the green in these bars here. Obviously, the Microsoft deal in County Kerry features here. The interesting thing about PPAs is they're not happening in every country. There are still regulatory barriers to them. Germany, France, Spain, Italy don't feature yet. That is about to change. The barriers are being removed, and the EU's new clean energy package requires all barriers to PPAs to go. But you're giving a good example here in Ireland. Now, people are often surprised when they see the league table of who are the off-takers who are signing these PPAs. People assume it's Google, Apple, Facebook, Microsoft, and so on. Well, yes, they are there, but you've also got aluminium producers at numbers 1 and 4. You've got chemicals, you've got steel, you've got automotive. And this is a fantastic development, that these energy-intensive consumers of electricity are now seeing the light. They are recognizing that wind is the cheapest form of new power generation in most of Europe. Solar beats us in a few parts of southern Europe, not here in Ireland. But wind is the cheapest. So they are knocking on our door saying, you are cheap. We want to lock in our energy costs at your kind of prices. Can we sign a long-term PPA? They want 15 years. Fantastic. We get revenue stability for 15 years, and this is helping to plug that delta between the wholesale market price and our costs. And here you can see that heavy industry has now overtaken the ICT sector as the largest signatory of PPAs. Now in Wind Europe, we're very active on pushing PPAs. We're talking to national governments where regulatory barriers still exist. We're trying to improve the business model so that there's a model contract. For the smaller off-takers, things are easier. They don't have to pay large amounts of money to lawyers. Apologies to the lawyers among you in the audience. I know there are many. We're trying also to create models for aggregation so that groups of smaller off-takers can come together and sign a single PPA with one wind farm, or groups of smaller wind farms can come together and sign a PPA with one large off-taker. And the resource platform is the platform we've set up with Solar Power Europe and a few other organizations to take forward all of this work. Their annual conference is coming up in Amsterdam in November. Now, I would like, towards the end, just to say a few words about offshore wind. The blue that you can see here are the projects that are at the planning stage. The pink are those projects that are online. The yellows are under construction or development. There's a lot of it going on. Look how the turbine size has risen already, averaging 6 megawatts now. That was the average of all the new offshore turbines installed last year. And look how it's set to rise by 2030. GE will have their 12 megawatt machine being tested in the Netherlands already next year, and it will be installed from 2021. MHI Vestas have a 10 megawatt machine that is now nearly ready for the market that will be installable in 2021 as well. And this is helping to drive down costs. It's helping to push up capacity factors. These are the DNVGL numbers on capacity factors for offshore wind at the top, then onshore wind, and then solar PV in green. And this is the outlook for new installations for offshore wind across Europe over the next 10 years. We've built in a share for Ireland here. We know you have some very significant projects under development, and sometime in the next decade, we are confident, as I know you are, that some of them will be deployed. So that is great. Final observation on offshore wind. Don't forget floating offshore wind. The red are the seas that are up to 50 meters depth, where we do fixed bottom. That's just about everything we've done so far. The yellow is beyond 50 meters depth, where you can't do fixed bottom, you have to do floating. If you look at your seas, you quickly get to yellow. Now, floating is coming of age. As you know, Scotland now has the world's first floating offshore wind farm, 30 megawatts, installed last year by Statoil as they were then, now Equinor. Portugal will be installing another 30 megawatt project next year. France is developing some pilot projects. We'll have about 300 megawatts of floating online by the end of this decade, we estimate, and this could be playing a major role in Ireland as well. I'd like to say something, because David, you said so much about community engagement, about happy coexistence. This has become a top priority for Wind Europe. We are taking up more and more of Europe's land and Europe's seas, fact, and we're going to be taking up much more of it over the next 10 years. It won't work if we do not define models of happy coexistence, not just with our communities, so that they're happy with our wind farms and we get 75% levels of support, but also with other industries that need the same space that we want: shipping, fishing, the military. We have a military platform inside Wind Europe where we talk to air forces and defense ministries about radar installations and how we can improve our technology and their technology to have happy coexistence between wind and radar. It's about the biodiversity interests as well. But of course, crucially, it's about community engagement. It's great to see all the things that are happening here in Ireland. The photo on the right-hand side is, I don't know which wind farm in Ireland, but it's one of them. And it was great to see in the front inset of your latest magazine all of these happy communities in front of their wind farms. Wind Europe have recently published a toolkit for developers on the do's and don'ts for community engagement. I strongly suspect that this is motherhood and apple pie to all of the developers in this room, because community engagement is such a challenge here in Ireland. But if you're interested to see the Wind Europe advice to developers, come and I'll give you one of these cards. It's a very nice web-based toolkit which was part funded by the EU, listing all the good practice on community engagement. And of course, you've got some great examples across Ireland. You've had the until very recently, Cuilse SSE project here in Cluj Valley, not far from here, which has put 20 million euros into the local community. You've got the Raheenley project on the east of the country, which is putting 45,000 euros a year into local community projects. And down in Kerry, I've mentioned it already, the Microsoft project, which is feeding the local data center and creating jobs in the local community. That is great. You'll be pleased to know these three projects feature in the Wind Europe compendium of good practice around Europe of community benefits from wind. And this is something we are plugging to governments, not just the macroeconomic benefits of wind and our 250,000 jobs across Europe, our 8 billion exports. Fine, that's nice for the macroeconomists among us, but it's the community local benefits that we've got to stress. And we've got a whole tool on our website now with loads of examples of good practice, and I wanted to single out 3 of your projects that feature in that tool. Now, I have one more slide, and it's one thing I've not mentioned, and some of you might think it's perhaps surprising, given where I come from, that I haven't mentioned this, but this is a letter that Wind Europe recently co-signed to Jean-Claude Juncker and Theresa May. And you can guess what it is about. I haven't bothered putting a title on this slide. Let me just say this to you, ladies and gentlemen. Wind Europe is shouting very loud indeed in Brussels and in other national capitals of Europe about the crucial importance of the UK electricity market and system remaining as closely integrated as possible to the EU 27 energy system. That means the UK remaining integral to the internal electricity market across the EU, and of course, crucially, it means no change to the single electricity market that you have here on this island. Now, what can I say about this? Firstly, on the single electricity market, everybody on the Commission side and the UK government side tells us that whatever happens, the single electricity market on this island is going to be okay, even in a no-deal scenario. That is widely understood by all the politicians involved. That is sacrosanct. Okay? For the internal electricity market, it's a little bit more complicated still. There will be some disruptions, probably, notably in terms of the links between the UK power exchanges and EU 27 power exchanges. But there is a strong desire on both sides to minimize those disruptions. And actually, maybe we're quite lucky that electricity isn't seen as one of those top priority political issues in the Brexit negotiations, and there's some sensible progress being made between the UK and EU negotiators on it that is kind of moving ahead happily under the radar. But there's not much more than that I can say at this stage. Of course, as you all know, the next 2 months or so are going to be crucial both in Brussels and in Westminster. Sorry, I've spoken for far longer than I should have done. If you want copies of our report on electrification, come and see me. If you want copies of the link to our toolkit on community engagement, come and see me. Thank you very much for your attention.